The terminal was packed, the kind of chaotic mess that makes people question why they ever chose to fly. But up here, near the gate for first-class boarding, the air was different. It smelled of expensive perfume and polished leather. The passengers waiting in this area didn't look tired. They looked impatient. They checked their watches and tapped their feet, acting as though the entire airport schedule was revolving around them. Eleanor sat in a plush chair near the floor-to-ceiling windows, her designer luggage arranged neatly beside her. She was a woman who was used to getting exactly what she wanted, exactly when she wanted it. At 60 years old, she had spent a lifetime building a bubble around herself, a world where comfort was a right and not a privilege. She adjusted the silk scarf around her neck, eyeing the gate agent with a look that could melt ice. The agent hadn't even called the boarding group yet, but Eleanor was already standing up. She didn't like waiting for lines. She preferred to be the first one on and the first one off. Finally, the intercom chimed. The agent's voice echoed through the gate area, announcing that pre-boarding for first class and priority members would begin. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She grabbed her purse, stood up straight, and marched toward the podium. She didn't look at the other people sitting there. She didn't need to. In her mind, they were just background noise. She handed her ticket to the agent with a sharp, practiced smile. "Thank you," she said, though the tone suggested she was the one doing them a favor. As she walked down the jet bridge, the familiar hum of the plane grew louder. Stepping onto the aircraft, the air was cool and crisp. The flight attendants, dressed perfectly in their uniforms, stood at attention. One of them, a younger woman with a bright, professional smile, stepped forward to greet her. "Welcome aboard, ma'am. Can I take your coat for you?" the attendant asked. "No, I'll keep it," Eleanor said briskly, brushing past her slightly. She found her seat quickly 1A, the aisle seat on the right side. It was the best seat in the house. Plenty of legroom, easy access to the aisle, and far away from the galley noise. She sat down with a sigh of relief, smoothing out her skirt. This was her sanctuary. She pulled out a magazine from her bag and placed it on the tray table, ready to disconnect from the world for a few hours. She watched the other passengers trickle in, feeling a sense of superiority as she saw them struggle with overhead bins and shuffle. Down the narrow aisle, the cabin began to fill up. Businessmen in suits loosened their ties. Tourists looked around wide-eyed at the luxury of the front cabin. Eleanor ignored them all. She was in her own world. Until the flow of traffic stopped abruptly near the second row. She glanced up from her magazine, annoyed that someone was blocking the aisle. A man was standing there, waiting for the person in front of him to sit down. He was tall, probably in his late 30s, and he was dressed very differently from the usual first-class crowd. He wore a gray hoodie, a worn-out pair of jeans, and sneakers that looked like they had seen a lot of miles. A simple black backpack was slung over one shoulder. Eleanor frowned. She looked at his ticket, then at the seat numbers. The seat next to her, 1B, was still empty. Her stomach did a small flip. Surely he wasn't sitting here. He looked like he belonged in the back of the plane, squeezed into a middle seat. Maybe he was just trying to store his bag and got confused, but he didn't move toward the back. The person in front of him sat down, clearing the path. The man in the hoodie took a step forward and stopped right at Eleanor's row. He looked at the number on the seat, then looked down at her. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was deep, calm, and polite. He shifted his backpack higher on his shoulder. Eleanor didn't move. She didn't say "excuse me" back. She just stared at him, her eyes scanning his clothes with undisguised judgment. "Is this seat 1B?" he asked gently, pointing to the empty spot right beside her. A flight attendant appeared behind him, carrying a stack of blankets. "Oh, let me help you with that bag, sir," she said cheerfully, reaching out to take his backpack. Eleanor's hand shot out. She didn't touch the attendant, but she waved her hand in a sharp, dismissive motion. Cutting the woman off? "Actually, no," Eleanor said, her voice loud enough to cut through the low hum of conversation in the cabin. "He is not sitting here." The flight attendant froze, her hand halfway in the air. The man in the hoodie looked at Eleanor, his eyebrows raising slightly in surprise. He didn't look angry, just confused. "Ma'am," the flight attendant asked, her smile faltering slightly. "You heard me," Eleanor snapped, closing her magazine with a loud thud. She crossed her arms over her chest, a physical barrier between herself and the man standing in the aisle. I am not sitting next to him. Find him another seat. The cabin seemed to get very quiet. The chatter from the row behind them died down. People stopped putting their bags away. They started to watch. Eleanor didn't notice, or perhaps she didn't care. She was used to commanding rooms, and she felt entirely justified in her demand. The man in the hoodie looked at the flight attendant, then back at Eleanor. He stood there, relaxed and composed. Is there a problem? He asked. This is the seat on my ticket. I don't care what your ticket says, Eleanor said, turning her nose up slightly. I paid for a comfortable flight. I paid for peace and quiet. I am not going to spend the next 6 hours squeezed in next to. She waved her hand at him, as if he were a piece of trash on the sidewalk. Someone who clearly doesn't belong in this section? A few gasps came from the seats behind them. The air in the cabin grew heavy. The flight attendant's face turned a shade of red, flustered and embarrassed by the outburst. Ma'am, the attendant said, stepping in front of the man slightly, as if to shield him. The flight is completely full today. First class is sold out. There are no other seats available. Eleanor let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. You have got to be kidding me. This is a 5-star airline. You mean to tell me you expect me to sit next to him? She turned her glare to the other passengers, looking for an ally. Does anyone else see this? I am a frequent flyer. I have status with this airline. You're going to let this happen? The man shifted his weight. He looked at Eleanor with a tired expression. It's like he had seen this kind of thing before and knew it wasn't worth the energy to fight. It's really all right, he said to the attendant softly. If there is an issue, I don't mind taking an economy seat. I just want to get where I'm going. His kindness only made Eleanor angrier. It annoyed her that he wasn't fighting back. She wanted him to be difficult, to prove her right about him. Instead, his calm dignity made her look small. No, the attendant said, finding a bit of courage. She straightened her back. Sir, you are in the correct seat. You paid for first class, and you are entitled to it. She turned back to Eleanor, her voice firm. Ma'am, please. We need to take off shortly. You need to take your seat. I will not, Eleanor said, her voice shrill. She pulled her phone out of her purse. Do you know who I am? I will call your corporate office right now. I will have your job. Move him. The attendant looked like she wanted to cry, but she stood her ground. Ma'am, please sit down. Eleanor didn't sit. She stood up, towering over the armrest, staring daggers at the man. You people think you can just do whatever you want, she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. You dress like a slob. You come up here, and you think you're equal? You're not. The man stood silently. He adjusted the strap of his backpack. He looked at Eleanor with pity, not hate. That look unsettled her more than anything else. He wasn't looking at her with anger. He was looking at her like she was a sad, lonely woman who didn't understand the world. Is there really no other seat? He asked the attendant again. None, sir, she said apologetically. Then I will sit, he said. He waited for Eleanor to move, but she stood her ground, blocking the aisle. The plane was ready to push back from the gate. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and asking flight attendants to prepare for departure. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Everyone in first class was watching the scene unfold, phones hidden in laps, recording the interaction or texting friends about the crazy woman in seat 1A, Eleanor. Fueled by a lifetime of privilege and unchecked prejudice, had no idea that she was digging a hole she wouldn't be able to climb out of. She had no idea that the man she was treating like a servant was someone who would turn her entire world upside down in a matter of minutes. She just saw the color of his skin and the clothes on his back, and she decided that was enough to judge his worth. Sit down, ma'am, the flight attendant pleaded, her voice shaking. Please. I refuse to be subjected to this, Eleanor declared, flipping her hair over her shoulder. She planted her feet, thinking she was the queen of the castle, completely unaware that the kingdom was about to crumble around her. The silence that filled the first-class cabin was heavy. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind that happens right before a storm breaks, or when someone says something so shocking that nobody knows how to react. Eleanor stood in the narrow aisle, her chest heaving slightly, her face flushed. She was waiting for the flight attendant to crumble. She was waiting for the manager to come running and apologize. She was used to people scrambling to fix her problems, no matter how unreasonable they were. But the flight attendant, whose name badge read Amanda, did not scramble. Instead, she took a deep breath and stood her ground. She looked tired, but her eyes were steely. "Ma'am," Amanda said, her voice low but firm, "I have asked you politely to take your seat. This flight is completely full. There is nowhere else for this gentleman to go. You cannot demand that we throw a paying passenger off the plane because you don't like the way he looks." Eleanor let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. She looked around at the other passengers, her eyes wide, as if to say, "Asterisk, can you believe this? I don't like the way he looks. You think this is about fashion? It's about standards. It's about safety. It's about comfort. I have paid a premium price for this seat. I have rights. We all have rights, ma'am." A voice spoke up from the row directly behind them. Eleanor spun around. A man in a sharp business suit was looking at her over his seat. He wasn't looking at her with admiration. He was looking at her with disgust. He held up his phone slightly, showing her the screen. "And I have a right to fly without listening to this nonsense any longer. We are all waiting on you. Please sit down." Linda's mouth opened, then closed. She felt a flash of heat rise up her neck. She wasn't used to being contradicted. She turned back to Amanda, ignoring the businessman. "I want to speak to the purser. Bring me the senior flight attendant. Right now." Amanda nodded curtly. "Fine." She stepped away to the front galley, leaving Eleanor standing in the aisle next to the man in the hoodie. The man hadn't moved. He was just standing there, holding his backpack, looking at the floor. He seemed uncomfortable, but not in a guilty way. He looked like a man who was waiting for a tantrum to end so he could get on with his day. Eleanor looked him up and down, sneering. "You must be very proud of yourself," she hissed, stepping closer so only he could hear. "Causing a scene, holding everyone up. Is this what you do? Force your way into places you don't belong." The man looked up. His eyes were dark, calm, and intelligent. He didn't look away. He didn't look angry. He looked at her with a sort of sad curiosity, like a scientist observing a strange insect. "I just want to go home," he said softly. His voice was steady. "Or to work, wherever that is. I have a ticket. That's all I have." "Don't play innocent with me," Eleanor snapped. "People like you always play the victim. Well, I'm the customer here. And I'm telling you, you are not sitting next to me." The man didn't reply. He just shifted his weight and waited. A few moments later, another woman in a uniform appeared from the galley. This was the purser, the head of the cabin crew. She walked with authority, her face set in a neutral mask. She had seen everything from air rage to medical emergencies, and she knew how to handle difficult passengers. She stepped right up to Eleanor, invading her personal space just enough to establish dominance. "What seems to be the problem here, ma'am?" the purser asked, though she clearly knew exactly what the problem was. "The problem is that you are forcing me to sit next to this person," Eleanor said, pointing a manicured finger at the man. "I am allergic to his detergent. I am allergic to his attitude. I refuse to be subjected to this for 6 hours. Move him. Move me. Put him in economy where he belongs. I don't care. Just get him away from me." The man sighed audibly, a quiet sound of exhaustion. He set his backpack down on the floor gently. "Listen," he said, speaking to the purser now. "I really don't want any trouble. If it helps, I can go sit in the jump seat. I can stand in the back. I just want the plane to take off." "It is not his job to stand in the back," the purser said sharply, turning a cold eye to Eleanor. "Sir, you stay right there. Do not move." Then she turned back to Eleanor. "Ma'am, let me be very clear. This aircraft is full. Every single seat is occupied. We cannot move you because there are no empty seats. We cannot move him because he has a valid boarding pass for 1B. If you continue to refuse to take your assigned seat, I will have to involve the captain and airport security. And I can promise you They will not remove a polite paying passenger just because you don't like his clothes. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, replaced instantly by a hot, prickly rage. This wasn't happening. This was a nightmare. She looked at the other passengers again. Some were shaking their heads. Others were openly laughing at her. One woman a few rows back was actually filming the confrontation with her phone. "You are filming this?" Eleanor shouted, pointing at the woman with the phone. "Put that away. That is illegal." "It is perfectly legal," the woman replied, not putting the phone down. "The world needs to see what you're really like." Eleanor turned back to the purser, desperate. She tried a different tactic. She switched from angry to pleading, putting on a fake, trembling voice. "Please, you don't understand. I have a condition. I get anxiety in small spaces. I need to feel safe. I can't feel safe with a stranger right on top of me. Surely you can understand that." The purser didn't buy the act for a second. She crossed her arms. "Anxiety is a medical issue, not a discrimination issue. If you are too ill to fly, we can have paramedics remove you from the plane. But you are not dictating who sits in the seat next to you." Eleanor's hands balled into fists at her sides. She felt trapped. She looked at the man in the hoodie. He was still waiting, patient as a stone. He looked at the purser and gave a small, almost invisible nod, as if to say, "It's okay, just let it go." "See? Even he knows he doesn't belong here." Eleanor seized on the moment. "He has been more polite and reasonable than you have been since we started boarding," the purser said. Her voice cut through the air like a knife. "Now, for the last time, ma'am, sit down." The purser emphasized the words, pausing between them. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff. Doors are arming." This was it. The point of no return. Eleanor looked at the seat. It looked like a cage to her now. She looked at the man. He smelled like fresh air and soap. He looked clean. He looked kind. He looked like a human being. But in her mind, he had become an obstacle. He was the thing standing between her and what she wanted. She let out a huff of air. A dramatic, theatrical sound that was meant to show everyone just how much she was sacrificing. "Fine." She spat out the word like it was poison. "But I will be reporting every single one of you. You have ruined my trip. You have ruined my day." She flopped into her seat, crossing her arms so tightly across her chest that her shoulders hunched up. She jammed her body as close to the window as possible, pressing her face against the plastic pane. Trying to put as many inches between herself and the aisle as she could, the man in the hoodie remained standing for a moment. He looked at the purser. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You're welcome, sir," the purser said, her expression softening instantly when she looked at him. "I am so sorry for the delay and the unpleasantness." "It happens," he said. He shrugged his backpack off his shoulder and placed it under the seat in front of him. Then he sat down in 1B. The armrest was the only thing separating him and Eleanor. As he buckled his seatbelt, the armrest moved slightly. Eleanor flinched as if she had been burned. She grabbed a travel pillow from her bag and hugged it to her chest, creating a barrier. She refused to look at him. She stared out the window at the tarmac, her jaw clenched tight. She was fuming. She was already drafting the angry email in her head. She was going to destroy this flight attendant. She was going to make sure the airline knew they had lost a valuable customer. Beside her, the man settled in. He pulled out a book, worn and dog-eared, and opened it. He didn't look at Eleanor. He didn't try to make small talk. He didn't apologize for existing. He just sat there reading. The plane began to push back. The safety demonstration started. Eleanor watched the flight attendants go through the motions, her eyes burning with resentment. She had won the battle in her mind. She had forced the issue. She had made her stand. But looking around, she saw that the other passengers were still whispering. The air in the cabin was still hostile. But it wasn't directed at the man. It was all directed at her. She didn't realize it yet, but the real judgment was just beginning. She had made a spectacle of herself based on nothing but prejudice. She had humiliated a man who didn't deserve it simply because she could. And as the engines roared to life, lifting the heavy plane into the sky, Eleanor had no idea that the man sitting inches away from her was about to change everything. She didn't know that in a few minutes, the very people she was counting on to save her would turn their backs on her. She just thought she was better than him. She was wrong. The plane was taxiing down the runway, the rumble of the engines vibrating through the floor. For most people, this was the moment to relax, to switch off their phones and prepare for the journey. But for Eleanor, the vibrations only felt like agitation. She sat bolt upright, staring straight ahead, refusing to turn her head, even a fraction of an inch toward the window or the aisle. She was determined to pretend she was alone in a bubble. The man in the hoodie Davids sat quietly beside her. He had his book open, resting lightly on his knees, turning the pages with a gentle rhythm. He hadn't looked at her since she sat down, and for that she was grateful. She was still fuming, her mind racing with the angry complaints she was going to file the moment they landed. As the plane turned onto the active runway and the pilot throttled up the engines for takeoff, the intercom chimed. It was the usual pre-departure announcement, but the pilot's voice sounded strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, please prepare for takeoff. We have a short delay before departure due to some final paperwork. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Eleanor rolled her eyes. "Now there's paperwork?" she muttered under her breath, loud enough for the flight attendant walking by to hear. This airline is a complete joke. The acceleration pushed her back into her seat, and within seconds, the massive metal bird lifted off the ground. The wheels clunked into the landing gear bays, and the city lights below began to shrink into tiny sparks. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, the fastened seatbelt sign dinged off. The flight attendants immediately jumped into action, beginning the beverage service to calm the frayed nerves of the cabin. After the boarding drama, Amanda, the flight attendant from earlier, approached the first-class row. She looked professional, but there was tightness around her eyes. She stopped at Eleanor's seat first. "Can I get you something to drink, ma'am? Maybe a glass of wine or some water?" Eleanor didn't look at her. She kept her eyes fixed on the back of the seat in front of her. "I'll have a champagne. The expensive one. And make sure it's cold." "Yes, ma'am," Amanda said softly. She turned to David. "And for you, sir. Can we get you started with anything?" David looked up from his book and smiled. It was a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "Just some water, please. With ice." "Thank you." Amanda nodded and moved away to fulfill the orders. Eleanor watched her go, feeling a small spark of satisfaction. She had demanded the best, and she would get it. That was how the world worked. Just as Amanda returned with a tray holding a flute of champagne and a glass of water, the forward door of the plane, usually reserved only for the flight crew and pilots, clicked open. A man stepped onto the cabin floor. He was tall, wearing a crisp, tailor-made suit that screamed money and authority. He was breathing hard, like he had been running, and his hair was slightly mussed. He wasn't wearing a pilot's uniform. He looked like a corporate executive who owned the airline. The cabin chatter died down again. It was extremely rare for a non-crew member to enter the cockpit or the front galley during flight. The man in the suit ignored everyone else. He scanned the first-class cabin, his eyes locking onto the first row. He walked quickly down the aisle, passing the businessman who had defended David earlier. When the man in the suit reached row 1, he stopped right in front of David. "Sir," the executive said, slightly out of breath, "I am so sorry. The ground crew held me up at security. I meant to be here before you pushed back." Eleanor paused, her champagne halfway to her lips. She watched the interaction out of the corner of her eye. Who was this man? And why was he apologizing to the person in the hoodie? David closed his book and looked up. "It's fine," he said calmly. "We're in the air. That's all that matters." "It is not fine," the executive insisted. "I know you hate being late. Is the cabin service acceptable? Did you have everything you needed before you boarded?" "Yes. Everyone has been very helpful," David said. He gestured slightly toward Amanda, who was standing frozen by the drink cart, looking very confused. The executive turned to Amanda. "Is everything okay here? I saw some notes on the passenger list about a disruption in boarding." Amanda hesitated, looking from the executive to Eleanor, then back to David. She seemed unsure of whether she should speak. We had a small seating issue, sir, but it has been resolved. The executive's face darkened. He looked at David. What kind of issue? David shrugged again. Just a misunderstanding about the seat assignment. It's handled. I don't want to make a fuss. The executive looked at Eleanor for the first time. He didn't look at her as a customer. He looked at her like she was a problem. Ma'am, he said coldly, is this passenger referring to you? Eleanor set her champagne glass down on the tray table with a sharp clink. She felt a surge of confidence. Finally, someone in a suit was talking to her. This was management. This was someone who would understand. Yes, actually, Eleanor said, turning in her seat, her nose held high. I am glad you are here. This flight has been a disaster from the start. I paid for first class, and I was forced to sit next to him. I refused. Of course, but your staff here threatened to remove me from the plane. I have never been treated so poorly in my life. I expect a full refund for this flight. And I suggest you retrain your staff on how to handle priority passengers. She crossed her arms, waiting for the executive to nod. To apologize, to offer her miles or a voucher. She expected him to turn to David and tell him to move, but the executive didn't move. He didn't nod. He didn't take notes. He just stared at her with a look of absolute disbelief. Priority passenger? The executive repeated slowly. Yes, Eleanor snapped. I have been a Diamond member for 15 years. I spend a lot of money with this airline. The executive let out a short, humorless laugh. He turned to David. Sir, do you mind if I handle this? David leaned back. Be my guest. The executive looked back at Eleanor, and the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. He leaned down, placing his hands on the armrests of Eleanor's seat, invading her space. Do you have any idea who this man is? The executive asked, his voice quiet but dangerous. Eleanor scoffed. I don't care who he is. He looks like he got dressed in the dark. This man, the executive said, pointing a finger at David, is Dr. David. He is the world-renowned neurosurgeon who has just flown in from a conference in Geneva. He is the keynote speaker at the Global Medical Summit happening in this city tomorrow. He is a guest of honor and a personal friend of the airline's CEO. Eleanor's smile faltered. Her brain scrambled to process the words. Asterisk neurosurgeon. Keynote speaker? She looked at David. He was sitting there in his gray hoodie and jeans, looking completely unassuming. He didn't look like a doctor. He didn't look like a genius. He looked like the person she had labeled him as 10 minutes ago. That can't be right, Eleanor stammered. He looks like a man who values comfort over fashion when he travels. The executive cut in sharply. But more importantly, he is a man who has saved hundreds of lives. Last year, he pioneered a surgical technique that changed the medical world forever. And today, you treated him like trash. The cabin was deadly silent. Every single person in first class was leaning forward, listening. The businessman behind them was nodding slowly, putting the pieces together. Amanda, the flight attendant, had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. Eleanor felt the blood rushing from her face. Her hands, which had been crossed so confidently over her chest, suddenly felt numb. She looked at David again, really looked at him this time. She saw the intelligence in his eyes, the calmness of a man who operated under pressure. She realized she had made a catastrophic mistake. I didn't know, she whispered. It doesn't matter if you knew, the executive said, his voice rising. You don't treat human beings like that. It doesn't matter if he is a doctor, a teacher, or unemployed. He is a human being. But the fact that you were rude to one of the most respected men on the planet, that takes a special kind of ignorance. He stood up straight, towering over her. I am the vice president of operations for this airline. And I am telling you right now, your status means nothing to me. Eleanor's stomach dropped. The diamond member card she held so tightly in her mind suddenly felt like worthless plastic. You, she started. But her voice cracked. The executive turned away from her, dismissing her completely. He turned back to David, his entire demeanor changing back to one of respect. Dr. David, please, accept my sincerest apologies on behalf of the entire airline. We value you immensely. If there is anything I can do to make this flight more comfortable for you, you name it." David looked at Eleanor, who was shrinking into her seat, shaking with humiliation. His expression wasn't angry. He just looked tired. "Just let her be," David said quietly. "She's made her point." Eleanor wanted the ground to open up and swallow the plane. She realized with a sinking heart that she wasn't the queen of the castle. She was the villain in the story. And the worst part was, she had done it to herself. She had no idea who he was, but she had just shown the world exactly who she was. The silence that followed the executive's revelation was heavier than the silence during the boarding argument. Before, people had been shocked by Eleanor's rudeness. Now they were looking at her with a mix of pity and contempt. It was the look people give to something they scraped off the bottom of their shoe. Eleanor sat frozen, her hands gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her face felt hot, a burning, prickly heat that she knew meant she was turning bright red. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but her throat felt dry and tight. No words came out. The vice president of operations was still standing in the aisle, his posture rigid and authoritative. He looked down at Eleanor, waiting to see if she would dare to speak again. When she didn't, he turned his attention back to David. "Sir, again, I am profoundly sorry," the executive said. "We do not tolerate this kind of behavior from our staff, and certainly not from our passengers. This is not the standard of service we aim to provide for you." David shook his head slightly, offering a gentle smile that seemed to calm the tension in the air. "Please, don't worry about it," he said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet cabin. "I've learned that some people carry a lot of anger around with them. It usually has nothing to do with me. Let's just move on. I'd like to finish my flight in peace." The executive nodded slowly, looking impressed by David's grace. "You are a better man than most, Doctor. But we cannot simply move on. We have policies regarding conduct and safety. When a passenger creates a disturbance, threatens the crew, and harasses another flyer, we have to take action." He turned back to Eleanor. This time, his gaze was not just angry, it was final. "Ma'am, you are currently in violation of our passenger contract of carriage." Lainer's head snapped up. "Contract? What contract? I haven't signed anything recently." "By purchasing the ticket and boarding the plane, you agreed to our terms," the executive stated matter-of-factly. "Specifically, the section regarding disruptive behavior and harassment of passengers and crew. You verbally assaulted a fellow passenger, attempted to have him forcibly removed, and delayed the departure of this aircraft." "I did not assault him," Eleanor protested, her voice rising an octave, sounding shrill and desperate. "I asked for a different seat." "That is not a crime. I have rights." "You have the right to remain in your assigned seat and behave like a civilized adult," the executive shot back. His voice was calm, which made it scarier. "You do not have the right to bully other people because of your own prejudices. You have disrupted the cabin. You have caused distress to our crew and to this doctor." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice so only the first-class passengers could hear. Though the effect was even more intimidating. "Here is the situation, ma'am. I am the senior-ranking officer on this flight right now. I have the authority to ban passengers from our airline. I have the authority to divert this plane to the nearest airport and have you met by police for causing a disturbance on an aircraft." Eleanor gasped. "You can't be serious, police." "Deadly serious," the executive said. "However, diverting the plane would punish everyone else on board, including Dr. David here. I don't want to do that to him. So, I am going to give you a choice. A choice I do not have to give you." The entire cabin was leaning in. Even the people in business class were craning their necks to see what was happening. It was better than any movie showing on the screens in front of them. "Option 1, the executive continued, holding up one finger. "You apologize to Dr. David right now? You apologize to the crew members you harassed. You sit in this seat, you do not speak to anyone, you do not ring your call button, you do not cause a single moment of trouble for the rest of the flight. If you do this, I will not have you arrested upon landing, though I will still be reviewing your frequent flyer status for suspension." Eleanor swallowed hard. Apologize? To him? To these people who had ruined her flight? The indignity of it was suffocating. But the thought of being dragged off a plane in handcuffs was worse. An option 2. She whispered, afraid to hear the answer. Option 2, the executive said. I tell the captain to turn this plane around. We land at the nearest airport. Law enforcement officers will board the plane, remove you from your seat, and escort you off the aircraft. You will be banned from flying with us ever again. And trust me, the other airlines share lists of passengers who are removed for safety violations. You might find it very hard to fly anywhere in the future. Elena looked around wildly. She was hoping someone would stand up for her. She looked at the businessman behind her, but he was shaking his head, a look of disgust on his face. She looked at Amanda, the flight attendant. Amanda was looking at the floor, trying to hide a smirk. Eleanor was alone. She was trapped in a corner of her own making. She looked at the man beside her. David, the doctor. He wasn't looking at her with hate. He wasn't even looking at her with the triumph she might have expected. He was just looking out the window, watching the clouds drift by. He seemed completely uninterested in her destruction. He had risen above her pettiness so completely that her insults looked like dust on his shoe. That calmness was the final straw. It broke her arrogance. She realized she couldn't win. She wasn't the main character in this story. She was the villain who had been defeated. I'll take option 1, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. Speak up, the executive commanded. And address Dr. David. Eleanor took a deep, shuddering breath. She turned her body toward the man in the gray hoodie. She looked at his profile. It felt like swallowing broken glass. Dr. David, she choked out, I am sorry for my behavior. Is that all? The executive asked. You need to mean it, and you need to apologize to the crew. Eleanor closed her eyes for a second. Tears of humiliation were stinging at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I am sorry for the way I acted, she said, a bit louder. I was wrong. I shouldn't have complained. I won't cause any more trouble. She turned to Amanda. I'm sorry to you too. It wasn't a heartfelt confession. It was a surrender. It was the plea of a defeated enemy. The executive stared at her for a long moment, judging her sincerity. He must have decided it was good enough because he finally straightened up. Okay, he said. We have an agreement. But let me be clear. If you so much as sigh loudly at a flight attendant for the next 6 hours, we are landing. Are we clear? Yes, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. Clear good. The executive looked at David. Sir, I apologize again. I'll leave you to your flight. David finally turned back from the window. He looked at the executive. Thank you for handling it. I just want to get some sleep now. Understood. The executive nodded to Amanda and the other crew members, then turned and walked back toward the front of the plane. The tension in the cabin didn't disappear entirely. It hovered in the air like a bad smell, but the immediate danger was gone. Eleanor sat back in her seat. She felt smaller than she ever had in her life. She pulled the magazine she had thrown onto the floor earlier back onto her tray table, but she couldn't focus on the words. The letters were swimming in front of her eyes. Beside her, David shifted in his seat. He opened his book again. The silence between them was deafening. Before, she had ignored him because she thought he was beneath her. Now, she was terrified to look at him because she knew he was above her in every way that mattered. She sat there, stiff as a board, staring straight ahead. She didn't dare order a drink. She didn't dare reach for her blanket. She just wanted the flight to be over. She wanted to disappear. The woman who had entered the plane an hour ago, full of entitlement and pride, was gone. In her place sat a humiliated woman who had been forced to confront the ugliness inside herself, and she had found it lacking. She had lost the battle, but more importantly, she had lost her dignity. And as the plane soared through the sky, she realized there was no drink, no upgrade, and no amount of money that could buy that back. The next 6 hours were the longest of Eleanor's life. Usually when she flew, she drank a glass of wine, watched a movie, and slept comfortably. She enjoyed the feeling of being taken care of. of being served. But this flight was different. It felt less like a journey and more like a prison sentence. She sat frozen in her seat, her posture stiff, afraid that if she moved too much, the flight attendant would think she was up to something. She kept her eyes fixed on the back of the seat in front of her, refusing to look out the window and refusing to look at the man sitting inches away from her. Beside her, David was the picture of calm. He finished his book, asked for a glass of water once, and then closed his eyes to sleep. He seemed to have completely forgotten about the confrontation, or perhaps he just didn't care enough to let it ruin his day. That was the thing that bothered Eleanor the most, his indifference. She had built up such a storm of rage and entitlement, and to him, she was just a bump in the road. When the wheels of the plane finally touched the tarmac with a screech and a thud, Eleanor let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for hours. She unbuckled her seatbelt the second the fastened seatbelt sign dinged off. She just wanted to grab her bag and run. She didn't want to see the looks on the other passengers' faces. She didn't want to see the judgment in their eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop and the captain has turned off the seatbelt sign." Eleanor was the first one to stand up, the first one to block the aisle while she got her things. Today, she waited. She sat meekly in her seat until the plane had taxied to the gate and the door hissed open. The executive from earlier wasn't at the door to say goodbye. He had likely gone back to the cockpit or another part of the plane to avoid another scene. But David didn't have to wait. He stood up slowly and grabbed his worn-out backpack. He looked down at Eleanor. For a split second, their eyes met. "Have a good day," David said quietly. It wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't mean. He was just being polite. It was the kind of polite you use with a stranger you will never see again. Eleanor couldn't find the words to respond. She just nodded, her face burning red, looked down at her shoes. David walked into the aisle and headed toward the front of the plane. As he passed the first row, the flight attendant, Amanda, stepped out of the galley. She stopped him. "Dr. David," she said, her voice warm, "I just wanted to say thank you for how you handled everything, and I'm sorry." "Really sorry?" He smiled at her. "You were wonderful. You did your job perfectly." "Thank you." She handed him a small business card. "If you ever need anything with your travel, please reach out directly. We take care of our own." He thanked her, tucked the card into his pocket, and walked off the plane. As he stepped into the jet bridge, the atmosphere in the cabin seemed to shift. The tension left with him. The moment he was gone, the whispers started. People were pointing at Eleanor, talking in hushed tones. "Can you believe that woman? Did you see her face? He was a doctor? Wow." Eleanor grabbed her designer bag and her purse. She felt like everyone was staring at the back of her head. She stood up and hurried toward the exit, keeping her eyes on the floor. As she passed Amanda, the flight attendant didn't smile. She didn't offer a warm goodbye or a thank you for flying with us. She just looked at Eleanor with a cold professional stare. It was a look that said, "We know what you did." Eleanor walked quickly through the jet bridge, her heels clicking loudly on the metal floor. She wanted to be invisible. She pushed through the heavy door and out into the busy terminal. The airport was crowded and noisy, a chaotic mix of travelers greeting their families and rushing to baggage claim. Normally, Eleanor walked through these crowds with her head high, feeling important. Today, she felt exposed. She felt like she was wearing a sign that detailed her terrible behavior. She headed toward the baggage claim, keeping her head down, trying to blend in with the crowd. But the universe wasn't done with her yet. As she rounded the corner near the carousels, she stopped. There was a small crowd gathered near the exit doors where the drivers waited. There were photographers with cameras and a few people holding signs. Eleanor paused, curious despite herself. Maybe a movie star was arriving. Maybe a politician? She moved closer, trying to see who was causing the commotion. Then, through the gaps in the crowd, she saw a familiar gray who. It was David. He was standing by a black SUV with tinted windows. A man in a suit was holding the door open for him. There was a woman there, dressed in hospital scrubs, shaking David's hand enthusiastically. A photographer was snapping pictures. The keynote speaker has arrived. Someone shouted, "Dr. David, can we get a statement on the new procedure?" David smiled patiently. He didn't seem to mind the attention, but he wasn't basking in it either. He looked like a man who had a job to do. He nodded to the photographer, said a few words to the woman in scrubs, and got into the SUV. The car drove away smoothly. Disappearing into the traffic, Eleanor stood frozen near the baggage carousel, watching the taillights fade. She felt a strange, hollow feeling in her chest. This was the man she had treated like trash. This was the man she had said was unfit to sit next to her. He was a VIP. He was important. People were excited to see him. He was saving lives. And what was she? She was just a woman with a lot of money and a lot of anger who had been humbled in front of a plane full of people. She watched as her suitcase came around the carousel. It was bright pink, easy to spot, just like she always wanted to be. She reached out and grabbed it, pulling it off the belt. It was heavy. She looked around for the skycap service she usually tipped to help her with her bags, but for some reason, she didn't call them over. She wanted to carry it herself. It felt like a small, strange act of penance. She dragged her luggage behind her, walking toward the exit where the rideshare apps were directing her. As she walked past the people who had been waiting for David, she heard them talking. "That guy is amazing," a young guy said to his girlfriend. "Did you read the article about him? He basically rebuilt that kid's spine." "Yeah, he seems so humble too," the girl replied. "Just a regular guy." Eleanor kept walking. Her driver pulled up to the curb, a nice sedan she had booked. The driver got out and opened the trunk for her. "Good evening, ma'am," the driver said cheerfully. "How was your flight?" Eleanor stood by the open car door for a moment. She looked back at the terminal building. She thought about David, sitting in his comfortable seat, heading to a hotel to prepare for a conference that would change medicine. She thought about the executive's voice, cutting through her arrogance. She thought about the silence in the cabin. It was educational, Eleanor said quietly. The driver looked at her, confused by the answer. "Oh, okay. Well, let's get you home." She climbed into the back seat of the car. As the driver pulled away from the curb and merged into the traffic, Eleanor looked out the window at the passing city lights. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass. She didn't look like the powerful, entitled woman who had boarded the plane that morning. She looked tired. She looked human. She reached into her purse to check her phone, expecting to see angry emails or notifications about her diamond status. But her phone was dead. She hadn't even realized it had turned off during the flight. It was just a black screen. She let the phone drop back into her bag. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window and closed her eyes. She knew that when she got home, she would have to face the reality of what had happened. She might lose her status. She might get banned. People might talk. But for the first time in a long time, she realized that status wasn't the most important thing. Respect was, and you couldn't buy that. You had to earn it, one interaction at a time. The car sped down the highway, carrying Eleanor back to her life, but she knew things would be different now. The world had seen her true face today, and worse, she had seen it herself. There was no going back to being the person she was before the flight. The only way forward was to be better, if she could ever find the courage to try.